The map showed divisions that didn't exist, armies that had been destroyed weeks ago, tens of thousands of soldiers who were dead, captured or scattered across the wreckage of the Reich. But in the underground bunker beneath Berlin's Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler moved phantom units across paper, issuing orders to ghosts, commanding victories from forces that had ceased to exist. Joseph Goebbels watched him do it. And for the first time in 12 years of absolute loyalty, the Reich Minister of Propaganda began to understand that the orders couldn't be followed anymore. Not because of cowardice, not because of betrayal, but because the men, the weapons, the armies themselves were gone. It was April 1945, and reality was finally catching up with the Third Reich. The gap between Hitler's orders and what could actually be accomplished had been widening for months. Since the failure of the Ardennes offensive in January, since the Red Army's breakthrough into Germany itself, the Führer had retreated further into his bunker and further into fantasy. He spoke of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, of armies being formed in the south, of inevitable victory if his generals would simply obey his orders with the fanaticism they deserved. Goebbels had always been the true believer. While other Nazi leaders hedged their bets, maintained foreign contacts, squirreled away wealth for potential exile, Goebbels burned every bridge. His propaganda had made him one of the most hated men in the world. There was no neutral country that would take him, no enemy that would spare him. His fate was bound to Hitler's absolutely, which made what happened in late April all the more devastating. By mid-April, the situation in Berlin had become mathematically impossible. The Red Army had encircled the city with over 2.5 million men. The German defenders numbered perhaps 45,000 regular troops and another 40,000 Volkssturm, old men and boys given rifles and told to stop the Soviet war machine. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, could barely get planes into the air. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe, was reduced to scattered battle groups and paper divisions. But Hitler's orders didn't reflect this reality. He commanded counterattacks by armies that existed only in his imagination. He demanded his generals hold lines with soldiers they didn't have. He moved divisions on maps while those divisions' survivors huddled in cellars or trudged west toward American lines, preferring capture by the Western Allies to the vengeance of the Red Army. The breaking point came with an order to SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner. Steiner was a capable officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, 50 years old and exhausted from years of brutal combat. In mid-April, he commanded what was grandly called Army Detachment Steiner, a collection of depleted units, Luftwaffe ground troops with minimal infantry training, and Volkssturm militia, who barely knew which end of a rifle to point at the enemy. His actual combat strength was perhaps 10 to 15,000 men, many of them teenagers or middle-aged conscripts. On April the 21st, Hitler summoned his remaining military staff to the bunker. The Red Army had broken through the final defensive lines north of Berlin. Soviet tanks were less than 20 kilometers from the city center. The encirclement was nearly complete. Hitler announced his solution. Steiner would attack from the north with his army detachment. He would cut through the Soviet forces, relieve Berlin, and drive the Red Army back. It was presented not as a desperate gamble, but as an obvious tactical move. The Führer spoke with the same confidence he'd shown when ordering the invasion of France in 1940. When his generals had thought him mad, and he'd been proven right. But this wasn't 1940. And Steiner didn't have an army. General Karl Koller, the Luftwaffe chief of staff, was present for the order. He later described Hitler's demeanor as detached from reality, but utterly certain. The Führer moved markers on the map, showing how Steiner's forces would advance, how they would link up with other units, how the tide would turn. He spoke of thousands of men who didn't exist, of tank support that had been destroyed weeks ago, of air cover from a Luftwaffe that had ceased to function. Goebbels sat in on the conference, his diary entries from this period among the last he would write. show a man still clinging to faith, but increasingly troubled by the disconnect between the Führer's words and the reports coming in from every sector. Soviet artillery was hitting the city center. The civilians he'd urged to defend Berlin to the last were dying in their thousands, and the relief forces Hitler kept promising never materialized. Koller left the bunker to relay the order to Steiner. He reached him by radio late on April 21st. Steiner's response was blunt. He didn't have the forces for an attack. His units were scattered, under strength, poorly equipped. An offensive would be suicide and accomplish nothing. He could maybe organize a limited defensive action, but a counterattack that would relieve Berlin? Impossible. Koller reported this back to the bunker. Hitler's response was to repeat the order. Steiner would attack. He must attack. Everything depended on it. Every available man was to be thrown into the assault. Officers who refused to commit their troops would be shot within 5 hours. This wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a direct order from the Führer. April 22nd, 1945, 3:30 in the afternoon. The daily military briefing in the Führer bunker. The room was cramped, the air stale. Concrete walls pressed in on the assembled officers. Hitler sat hunched over the map table, his left hand trembling from the Parkinson's that had been worsening for years. Goebbels stood against the wall, watching. The question was asked, had Steiner launched his attack? The answer came from General Hans Krebs, the Army Chief of Staff. No, Steiner had not attacked. His forces were insufficient. The units that were supposed to support him had been diverted to plug gaps in the crumbling defensive perimeter. The attack could not proceed as ordered. For a moment, Hitler said nothing. Then he asked the question again, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Had Steiner attacked? No, Krebs repeated. The attack had not taken place. What followed was described by every witness present as the final collapse. Hitler's face flushed red. His entire body began to shake, and then he started screaming, "Traitors! Cowards! Betrayal!" The words poured out in a torrent of rage and despair. The generals had sabotaged him from the beginning. The officer corps had never believed in National Socialism. They had undermined every offensive, failed at every crucial moment. The whole Wehrmacht was worthless, corrupt, disloyal. Everything was lost. The war was over. The Third Reich was finished. He collapsed into his chair, suddenly silent. Then he said it again, quietly this time. The war is lost. Those 4 words, from the man who had forbidden defeatism for years, who had ordered the execution of soldiers for retreating, who had demanded fanatical resistance to the last bullet. The war is lost. Goebbels stood frozen. In 12 years, he had never heard Hitler admit defeat, never heard him accept the possibility of failure. The Führer's entire persona was built on willpower, overcoming reality, on faith producing victory. And now, in a concrete room 16 meters underground, that persona shattered. The other officers began trying to salvage the situation. There were still options. Forces in the south could regroup. A fighting retreat could be organized. Hitler could leave Berlin, fly to Bavaria, continue the struggle from the Alpine redoubt. The war wasn't over if the Führer lived. Hitler shook his head. He would stay in Berlin. He would die in Berlin. Let the others flee if they wanted. Let them try to negotiate with the enemy. He was finished. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Officers fled the bunker to their own headquarters, beginning the final scramble to save themselves. The facade of unified command evaporated. Everyone suddenly remembered they had families to protect, escape routes to arrange, surrender terms to consider. Goebbels didn't leave. He remained in the bunker, and when the room cleared, he approached Hitler. What passed between them in that moment was witnessed by Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, who stood in the corridor outside. Goebbels spoke quietly but intensely. If the Führer had decided to stay in Berlin, then he, Goebbels, would stay as well. His wife Magda would stay. Their 6 children would stay. The family would die together in the capital of the Reich. This wasn't despair. Goebbels' voice remained firm, but the logical conclusion of everything they'd fought for. If the Reich couldn't survive, then neither would they. Hitler looked at him. Some of the wildness left his eyes. He nodded. What Goebbels said in that moment, what he felt, was documented in the final entries of his diary and in testimony from the handful of people who survived the bunker. He had realized something that broke through even his fanaticism. The orders couldn't be followed anymore, not because of moral failure or lack of will, but because the material basis for following them had ceased to exist. Steiner couldn't attack because Steiner didn't have an army. The Wehrmacht couldn't hold the line because there was no line left to hold. The Luftwaffe couldn't provide air support because there were no planes, no fuel, no pilots. The wonder weapons couldn't save them because the factories that built them had been bombed into rubble. The German people couldn't rise up in fanatical resistance because they were starving, traumatized, and desperate for the war to end. For 12 years, Goebbels had been the voice that made the impossible seem inevitable. His propaganda had convinced millions that Germany would triumph through sheer force of will. He had taken every military setback and spun it into a temporary obstacle on the road to final victory. He had made people believe that faith could overcome facts. But in that bunker, on April 22nd, facts finally won. The diary entry he wrote that night, one of his last, shows a man still trying to maintain the ideological framework even as reality demolished it. He wrote about the nobility of dying for the cause, about how their sacrifice would inspire future generations, about how they would enter history as martyrs rather than surrender as cowards. The propaganda minister was creating propaganda about his own death, trying to shape the narrative even as the story ended. But beneath the rhetoric, there was something else. An acknowledgement, perhaps unconscious, that the whole edifice had been built on sand, that orders couldn't create armies, that willpower couldn't manufacture tanks, that propaganda couldn't stop artillery shells. In the days that followed, as the Soviet noose tightened around Berlin, Goebbels moved through the bunker like a ghost. He still performed his duties. He was named Chancellor after Hitler's suicide on April 30th. But the manic energy was gone. He spoke to the remaining staff about continuing the fight, but his words were hollow. Everyone knew it was over. On May 1st, the day after Hitler's death, Goebbels made his final decision. He had his 6 children, Helga, 12, Hilde, 11, Helmut, 9, Hold, 7, Hedda, 5, and Heide, 3, sedated by an SS doctor. Then he had them poisoned with cyanide capsules. His wife Magda personally crushed the capsules into their mouths as they slept. Then Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked up the stairs from the bunker into the Reich Chancellery garden. An SS orderly shot them both. Their bodies were doused with petrol and set on fire, just as Hitler's had been the day before. The man who had spent 12 years making people believe in impossible victories died knowing that the final orders couldn't be followed. Not because of betrayal or cowardice, but because the armies were gone, the weapons were gone, the Reich itself was gone. What did Goebbels say when he learned Hitler's orders couldn't be followed anymore? According to witnesses in the bunker, his immediate response to the Steiner news was silence. He stood against the concrete wall watching Hitler's breakdown and said nothing. The propaganda minister, the man famous for always having words, had none. But his actions spoke clearly. He chose to die. Not in some last heroic stand, but in a bunker after murdering his own children, after the war had already been lost. He chose death not because he believed in ultimate victory, but because he couldn't face the alternative. A world where the orders couldn't be followed, where the faith had been proven false, where reality had the final word. In the end, Goebbels understood what Hitler never quite grasped, that you cannot command ghosts, cannot order phantom divisions to attack, cannot will victory into existence through force of belief alone. The orders couldn't be followed anymore because there was nothing left to follow them with. The Third Reich had spent its last soldiers, fired its last bullets, burned through its last reserves of both material and faith. What remained in that bunker in April 1945 wasn't a government or an army or even a cause. It was just men in a concrete hole, issuing orders to people who didn't exist, commanding victories that couldn't happen, maintaining the pretense of power until the very end. Goebbels had built his career on making people believe in that pretense. He had convinced millions that the impossible was inevitable, that faith could overcome facts, that will could triumph over reality, and when reality finally forced its way into the bunker, when the orders couldn't be followed anymore, he had nothing left but the choice to die rather than admit he'd been wrong. The Red Army found his charred corpse on May 2nd, partially burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, still wearing the Golden Party badge he'd been awarded for his loyalty. They identified him by his dental records and by the distinctive caliper he wore on his right foot, a remnant of childhood osteomyelitis that had left him with a limp he'd spent his life trying to hide. The man who had shaped reality through words died when words couldn't shape reality anymore, when the orders couldn't be followed, when the armies existed only on maps, when the Reich he'd helped build collapsed into the rubble of Berlin. That was his final message, though he never spoke it aloud. That propaganda ends where reality begins, that faith without foundation crumbles, that you can order the impossible, but you cannot make it happen. The silence in the bunker on April 22nd, when Goebbels learned that Steiner couldn't attack, that the orders couldn't be followed, that the war was truly lost, that silence was his answer. The propaganda minister had nothing left to say.